This particular introduction is the introduction to the residential neighborhoods in Palolo for our Palolo project. So this particular theme is looking at what's usually called vernacular architecture, which you might call architecture that people do for practical reasons versus, sort of formal architecture done by architects. And Palolo pretty much is, with the exception of maybe a few of the temples, is pretty much almost entirely vernacular architecture. Now, this particular theme is basically what we want to look at is, can you actually see people's sense of identity to where they live and indicators of how they're displaying themselves, which people do in what we call the built environment. People choose how to present themselves on land. And on the land, that might include what you put in your front yard, if you have a fence or not, the way that the colors you paint your house. I mean, all this type of stuff is part of a rather calculated move on the part of people to present themselves both to their neighbors and also people they don't know that might drive by. There's been a ton of work done on vernacular architecture in terms of especially residential architecture across the United States, but it's usually looking at particular, little theme groups, like maybe a Chinatown somewhere. We want to look at this in terms of the region that makes up Palolo. Now, we're also going to, at least in part, contrast a little bit to what we find on Monolani Heights, Wilhelmina Rise on one side, and maybe a little bit in terms of St. Louis Heights on the other side. And that has to do with the types of material we can access. We're sort of lucky, and also it's sort of creepy a little bit in terms of what we have access to. Now, on one hand, when we use Google Earth, which will be the main platform we're using in this particular theme. So if you're going to do this, you're going to get used to using Google Earth Street View. In Google Earth, you can actually drop down to street level. It's just like, it's basically an image from standing at that point on the street. And this has the huge advantage from our standpoint here, that it means that rather than having to walk through all of Palolo and, maybe 191 degrees in the sun or something like that, you can actually do this from the comfort of your, apartment or wherever. I'm looking on a digital screen. It also means that you're not stuck with, people wondering what you're up to. You're being nosy, but in Google Earth. So we can actually look at every house in Palolo and in the other area of Honolulu in Google Earth from the street, in Street View. Now, the other thing, which is actually a little more surreal, is if you go to the website Zillow, which I've actually got here in the proposal outline, that actually has, when you zoom in, it actually has the actual value of every property in the island, including all of Palolo. So how much each house is worth, what size it is in terms of bedrooms, and who owns it. For this part, we're not really interested in the who owns it so much. I'm not sure how we could use that data. But the relative value of the property is real interesting, because if you just sort of go wander through Zillow, you find very quickly that different clumps, for example, in Palolo, have pretty significantly different prices for the property. When you look at the house, there's not necessarily a close correlation between maybe the size of the house and what it's worth. We haven't had the time to actually go in and, for example, say if you look at the house in Google Earth, does it give you some idea why it has the value that it does in terms of assessed value? So there's three basic tasks that we're looking at in terms of getting people involved in this. One is actually going down on a block-to-block basis in Palolo and averaging out what their valuations are. In other words, what places are considered to be worth per block, so an average of 4. Now, this would also have to be tied to square meters or square foot in terms of what we're looking at in size of property, since obviously that would make a difference. We have, hopefully, I'm in contact with a couple of architect historians. Hopefully we will actually have an inventory form, which we're going to expect people to use when they're doing this, that actually allows you to check off when you're looking at a property, allows you basically to describe the property on the form while you're looking at this. So this real estate valuation will actually include, to a certain extent, the look and some description of the actual place name. The second task is sort of related, because this actually will be the actual inventory, using that inventory form when we actually get it worked up. And again, I think we already have it, it's just a matter of finding it. And this is, do we see variations between blocks and blocks, or maybe it's different one side of a street to another, in terms of the look of houses? Do people do different things in different parts of Palolo? Do those different things they're doing, or the different ways they're dealing with their land? For example, how do they landscape it? What type of plants do they have, in general? Is it all just lawn? Is it all covered over concrete? Is it actually got trees and ornamentals? Do they have no fence? Do they have a cyclone fence? Do they have a barbed wire fence? Do they have a brick wall? What are they saying both about their property and also their relationship with the neighborhood by virtue of things, especially front yards and fences and the front look of the house? Now, all of this, of course, is available in Google or Street View. So again, as with the first one, this is just, the data is there. It's just a matter of just pounding through, collecting the data in an organized, structured way so that we can then actually look at it. I can already guarantee that there are some parts of Palolo that actually look very much neighborhood in contrast to places maybe just a couple of blocks away. The Carlos Long subdivision being one of the most obvious. But if you're actually on, for example, 9th or 10th Avenue, you see really pretty obvious distinctions between one block and another. Now, we don't know who those people are, and we're not, to be honest, we're not that interested. What we are interested is there a commonality. In some areas of Palolo, you find that a lot of the houses, if someone's doing something, it looks like everyone else did sort of the same thing. So obviously there's some sensitivity to the neighbors sort of maybe not looking alike, but a commonality. In other parts of Palolo, you find that one house will be doing something totally different than the house on the other side of it. So you don't get that sense of commonality or maybe neighborhood. So what's actually visibly done on the landscape is actually an important part of what makes up neighborhood, because that's what people see when they walk by it, when they get into their front door, when they go out and they go driving. All this is a visible way that people either tie into a group, or in some other cases just say basically, to hell with you guys, I'm not part of this. Now, one of the things that we want to do is the last one of these tasks is actually expanding this up to Wilhelmina Rise specifically. And the reason for that is in the early 19th century, that particular area was sold as the Kaimuki land by the Kaimuki Land Company. And of course, Wilhelmina Rise isn't Kaimuki, or at least it isn't now. So we're very interested in how that compares and contrasts, since that development's occurring at roughly the same time, slightly earlier as Palolo. How do those two compare? And to be honest, I'm not sure. I have a sneaking suspicion Wilhelmina Rise is a fairly consistent neighborhood in a lot of it. But again, we're just making these guesses entirely off the top of our heads. So we need to see what type of clustering there is. Is Wilhelmina Rise actually a little cluster of little neighborhoods, maybe by the block or patterns? Or is there no pattern at all? So a lot of this is, again, as with all these other approaches, it's very much detective work. In this case, you've actually got the stuff. It's a matter of actually analyzing the visual and data material you've got to see what type of patterns you see. So it's not quite the same type of research-based. It's research, but not the same way. It's data-based research versus some of the other themes, which are more, doing like deep digging archival research. So that's the particular task on this theme. I think they're going to be quite interesting. In 2020, by virtue of what's available on the internet, all of this stuff is public domain. So we can actually find out sort of a surreal amount of stuff on people. What we want to do is try to collate that, organize it, and try to make sense of it so we can talk about Palolo and the area around it in some sort of meaningful way.